ignored his warning about not bringing my affair to our house. I wish I didn't. My life is ruined and completely over, and I did that to myself. I ruined my own marriage with my own hands and everything else. Chris was the best thing that could have ever happened to me as a woman, and I lost that. Hello, Reddit. My name is Michelle. For privacy's sake, all the names will not be the real ones, but just for you to understand and refer to the person I'll be writing about. I'm 26 years old, and I lived in Manhattan with my husband, soon-to-be ex, sadly, and it's all my fault. I met Chris when I had to go to the hospital to make a complaint about my health. Yes, he's a doctor, and he was the doctor on duty that day. Apparently, I had to have surgery because I had appendicitis, and I was pretty scared because I literally knew nothing about how everything worked because I hated hospitals. The last time I was there was when we came in with my dad, and he died eventually. So hospitals weren't exactly my favorite place to be at the time. Chris walked me through everything. He was kind, patient, and even when I had the surgery and was recuperating, Chris was always checking on me. He was the sweetest, and before long, I was deeply in love with Chris. But then Chris didn't exactly feel the same way about me because then he had a girlfriend, and they were actually quite cute together, but I wanted Christopher, and I was going to stop at nothing to get what I wanted. You see, I've been quite an ambitious person. I usually describe myself as ambitious then, but now I've realized that I was actually just selfish and a very greedy person. When I was a child, I would watch my father hit my mom and dictate everything for us. It was years after when my dad had died that my mother started to romp around with younger men because, according to her, she didn't get her free will while she was with Dad because she felt caged and was unhappy. I had sworn then that I would do anything to make myself happy, so I didn't end up like my mother, who was just starting to feel good in the wrong ways. But eventually, I ended up like her, as I ruined everything I worked for. I worked twice as hard if I had a goal. I wanted to come out the best and would do even the stupidest things to get them. Like one time when I was in high school and a new girl came in and she came out top of the class. I was livid, and I decided to become her friend and studied the way she read. And when it was test periods, I lied to her that the teacher manipulated some questions to see if we were brilliant enough to get them. She was a naive girl, and because she didn't have a lot of friends, she believed what I said, and by the end of that term, I had the highest scores again. I continued like that until she was withdrawn from our school, and then I thought it was because her parents were surprised at her dwindling studies. I later found out that she was on a scholarship program because her parents couldn't afford her fees. So when she kept dwindling, the school withdrew the scholarship. I felt guilty, but I couldn't stop. I wanted to get what I want, and I started to comfort myself with the fact that someone has to go down for someone to be up. Another time when I was in college, I liked a guy, but then he liked another girl in our class, and I was so jealous. So I set her up and lied to the guy about the girl being a slut. He lost interest in her, and then his attention turned on me, but I quickly stopped liking him when I got his attention and realized he wasn't that special. He wasn't bold enough and would stutter when I yelled at him. Another thing about me is that I got bored easily, so I dumped him and focused all my attention on my studies. Didn't have time for boys. That was until I met Chris. Chris was just so sweet and kind and loving. He had the cutest smile with his dimples usually on display, and he was really polite, especially to patients. He didn't think of them as overly sensitive or too paranoid, and answered all their questions with reassurance. So it was so easy to fall in love with him, and I made sure we got close and started to share things about each other. After a year of being friends, Chris suddenly told me he had a girl he liked, but I dismissed it as something not serious until he told me they were already together. I was so jealous, and I did everything in my power to end the relationship. They were together for a few months before I got my opportunity. Chris had sounded odd that day. I knew that he was on leave because he was slightly ill, but he was sounding like he was emotionally down. So when I prodded, he told me he and his girlfriend, had a fight over something that wasn't exactly worth it. I offered to bring him dinner to eat, but he declined. I insisted, and he eventually agreed. So I cooked his favorite and brought it over to him. Meanwhile, I had texted his girlfriend to come over, that he was really sick, and that he probably needed her around. So when Chris had eaten and was comfortable, I mistakenly poured a drink on myself and excused myself to wash it off. I removed my damp clothes and wore one of Chris's tops and waited until I heard voices in the living room before I came out. Just as I had wanted, she misinterpreted the situation and broke up with Chris. I was there for Chris through the heartbreak period. I was his rebound, I know, but I didn't mind because it made me happy when Chris finally noticed me. I was so happy that in my head I had already started to plan how our wedding was going to be and how our kids were going to look like. We dated for 6 months and I was starting to be impatient. I wanted to get married to Chris. He was my dream man and I couldn't lose him. I enjoyed the gifts he showered me with and the money too. I know that if I did get married to him, I wouldn't have to work again, and I desperately wanted that. Sad how it is like that when I worked hard for a degree that I eventually didn't want to use again. So since I was beginning to get desperate, I started to drop hints, but Chris wasn't getting it. Chris is a really smart man. I mean, he's a doctor, so he has got to be smart, right? But he was so bad at taking a hint for what it was. One time I was trying to hint at marriage by telling him I loved jewelry like rings and bracelets because they were beautiful accessories to one's hand. The next day, Chris came home with a small box, and I was so happy because I thought it was finally happening, but it was just a bracelet. It was really beautiful and seemed expensive, but it was not what I wanted, so I just pretended to be happy about it. We dated for more than a year before Chris finally asked me to marry him. Well, under my manipulation though. He thought I was pregnant. I wasn't, but I lied to him by buying a positive pregnancy test online. Chris was very happy, and the next day he popped the question. We started planning our wedding almost immediately, and my wedding turned out amazing. I was just so happy. I finally got what I wanted desperately. A few days after our wedding, knowing that Chris would begin to question why there were no visible signs of pregnancy from me, I faked a fall and went to another hospital different from where Chris worked and paid a nurse to give me fake results and some meds. Chris was so saddened by the news, and he didn't get over it until after 2 months. Everything went back to normal between us, and I was happy again. I was a housewife with no intentions of working. I loved sitting back at home and doing absolutely nothing but waiting for my husband to come home. But I soon got tired and bored of doing that, especially when Chris became the youngest director in his hospital and had to start spending more late nights and traveling all over the place. Though he would always offer that I come along with him, I hated traveling because I got sick each time I did, so I usually refused to go. But that got me paranoid and scared that Chris would find somebody else and leave me. So I began to pick fights with him, would search his clothes for any sex protection items, and also smell them to detect whether a female's perfume was on them. I know, I sound crazy. To be honest, I really was, and that eventually led to my own doom. At least that was until I met Mona. Mona was also married to a rich man who was much older than she was. Mona was very pretty, and she got attention everywhere she went. We met at a shopping mall and clicked because we seemed to have the same interests in the different items on display. We exchanged contacts and became friends easily. We'd meet up for tea at her place, but never mine. Mona and I were alike in a lot of ways. She was as ambitious as I was, hence that made her marry John for the financial gains. John obviously adored her and would give her anything she asked for, but she didn't exactly like him, as I noticed. Mona confided in me one time that she had done a surgery to close her womb so she wouldn't have to worry about giving birth to a child, one that John wanted desperately, as he had no child of his own. It was obvious she was extorting him and didn't love him at all. Whenever we went out, she spent the most and would even look down on me most times for spending so little. She never came over to my place because she felt my place would be as cheap as I was. Her words most times would make me so angry that I would then get home and lash out at Chris for giving me so little. One time, Mona wanted to host a party. It was recorded as the biggest party in town that month because Mona stopped at nothing to see to that. She hired 3 planners to deal with the whole thing, and she just dispensed the money accordingly. I became very jealous of her. I wanted what she had, and I wished that it hadn't, because that was when and where my doom started. So I had gone to the party with my husband, who hadn't wanted any part of it but was forced to when I started ranting again. That party made me more jealous and zealous to become just like Mona. All the wealthy people that showed up for the party, the things they wore, and I felt so out of place and so ordinary. In fact, I abandoned my husband at the party to relate to some of Mona's friends and also feel as if I belonged there. I think Chris got tired of waiting for me to do my socializing and eventually excused himself to leave. He had probably expected I'd follow him, but I didn't, and just focused on impressing my new friends. It was at that party that I met Nathaniel. Nathaniel was every bit of what I wanted and needed to improve myself and prove to Mona that I could be what she was. He was very rich, in fact almost as rich as Mona's husband, and he was young again, something Mona's husband wasn't. What made me more intentional about winning him over was the fact that Mona seemed to like him perhaps a little more than was required as friends. It made me more desperate to achieve what she couldn't with him, so I started to strategize on how to get him to notice me. It was particularly easy as he noticed me first at the party and came to talk to me. I turned on my charm and won him over, so we exchanged contacts and started texting. The first time he sent me some money, Chris discovered it and got very angry, but I begged him and lied that Nathaniel was just a friend and just felt like sending me some money and that I didn't ask him for any. Chris believed me and asked me never to contact Nathaniel again, but of course I didn't listen and continued talking to him. Chris was often busy at work, so it was easy to meet up with Nathaniel. That's how my first affair started. I was happy. I started spending as much as I liked with Nathaniel, and he was spoiling me silly with gifts and would take me on luxurious dates. I was finally getting what I wanted. Being up to standard with Mona felt like a lifetime achievement. I was spending as much as she was on our shopping dates. It was obvious she was jealous of me, and I was thriving on that fact. But I was ignoring my husband's position in all of this. I wasn't thinking clearly about how hard I had to work to get him to be my husband. I was only considering my selfish self, and every other thing didn't matter. Mona asked me one time who I was with, apart from my husband. That was giving me all the money that I was spending, and I lied to her about my rich uncle that I just discovered existed, and that he wanted to spoil me silly and make up for all the times he couldn't. Mona didn't believe my story, but I didn't care. All that mattered was I was a rich and classy girl and could spend money as I liked. Eventually, she found out. Oh, by the way, Nathaniel didn't know I was married. I lied that I was living with my dad, who mustn't find out I had a boyfriend, so it was easy to lie and say I couldn't come out whenever Chris was around. Though even when Chris was around, I was just usually on my phone texting Nathaniel, so I didn't even pay him that much attention. It must have been then that he became suspicious of me, but I was too busy spending time and money with Nathaniel to have noticed. So yeah, Mona found out I was with Nathaniel and threatened to tell Nathaniel about my marriage, but I was smarter and faster. I went to Nathaniel and told him that Mona was threatening to ruin our relationship by lying to him just because she was jealous, because she liked him. So when Mona came to him, he didn't believe her, and she became desperate, trying to prove the point that she must have said some things that infuriated Nathaniel, which I don't know. I wasn't there when she went to him, but when I came around, he made me promise not to ever speak to Mona again. I didn't mind so long as my relationship with him was safe, and that I still got to enjoy the luxurious life I was living. Now beside our house was a small building that was built by Patricia and her husband, and ever since her husband got sick, she became really close with Chris because he was their doctor. It irritated me a lot because I didn't exactly like her. She was way older than us, so Chris obviously couldn't be with her, but that's not why I hated her. She was intrusive, always trying to tell me what to do to make my husband happy and all that. I disliked her so much it became really obvious even to her, and she stopped coming over to our place. If she needed to speak to Chris, she'd call him or wait for him to get home, and it was fine by me. I mean, that meant I didn't have to hear the doorbell ring every 5 seconds to ask whether we wanted some vegetables that were ripe enough for harvest in her garden, or whether Chris was around. So this particular day, Nathaniel insisted on dropping me at home, even if it's not exactly at home but near home because he's never been to my house. I knew Nathaniel was starting to suspect me because he would ask me where I lived, why I had to leave at odd times, and some other silly questions, and I couldn't have that because that meant my luxurious lifestyle would have to come to an end, and I obviously didn't want that to happen, so I had to give in to his request of dropping me off that day. I thought I was safe because I knew Chris was working that night and wouldn't be back until morning. So when I accepted the offer and he had driven me close to home, He opened the door for me, and when I stepped out, he kissed me. Imagine how startled I was to see Patricia standing outside with a basket of tomatoes in her hand, probably coming from marketing her produce. I quickly stopped and excused myself. When I was sure Nathaniel had gone, I marched quickly to her place and knocked, but she refused to open up, saying it was bedtime and she had to take care of her husband, and that if I had any important thing to say, I had to wait until morning. I couldn't sleep. I knew how much Chris adored her and her husband, and he probably wouldn't doubt her words if she told him. I was so restless that night. Chris came home early the next morning and said he had to go and attend to Patricia's husband first, before he took his rest. I tried convincing him otherwise, but he insisted. My heart was in my throat, and so I decided I was going to come along with him under the pretense that I wanted to have a good relationship with them too. Chris was happy that I finally saw them as good people, but in my head, I was panicking so badly. We went over there, and immediately Patricia saw me. Her smile changed, and she let us in. Chris went in to check on her husband. When he left to do that, I knelt down and pleaded with her not to tell Chris about anything she saw the night before. She looked at me coldly and said she didn't see anything. I pleaded and pleaded, but she maintained her words, and I eventually gave up. I knew I was doomed. She could decide to ruin my marriage with just a sentence any time she chose to. I had to do something, but there was nothing I could do. So I stayed at home for a while and was always trying to get on her good side, but she would have none of it. She didn't want to talk to me or anything, and I became frustrated. I loved my husband, and I didn't want to lose him. But I didn't want to let go of Nathaniel too. Not because I loved him, but I loved his money. I didn't want to lose both, but Patricia still didn't want to hear me even speak at all. I observed Chris's behavior for a month, and I saw that there was no difference. I realized that she actually didn't tell him, and so he had no clue as to what I was doing. I continued seeing Nathaniel. In fact, I became bold to the extent of inviting him over to my marital home sometimes. Patricia would see us and still wouldn't say anything, so I used that as a sign that she didn't care that deeply about Chris as Chris thought she did, or perhaps she cared too deeply and didn't want to hurt him by telling him about my affair. Well, one time I became pregnant. I didn't know who the father of the baby was. I knew Chris had wanted a baby for so long that if he found out, he would be overjoyed. But then Nathaniel would break up with me for lying to him, and that meant I couldn't live the way I wanted to. But then again, if it was Nathaniel's, he would tell me to get rid of it, as he had always said he wanted to enjoy his freedom and not be tied to a wife or even a baby. So I decided to tell none of them and went by myself to get an abortion done. Till now, I regret that stupid action of mine, because if I hadn't done it, perhaps I'd at least have a companion right now instead of being all alone. I regret it so much now, as much as I regret betraying Chris. When Patricia's husband passed away, Chris was so heartbroken and I had to be there for him. But that was difficult as he was always with Patricia when he wasn't working, checking on her, and it was every bit awkward and uncomfortable as that meant I had to be around Patricia most of the time. And particularly because Patricia didn't even say 2 words to me whenever I was in the room, and it probably made Chris wonder what was wrong. After the whole incident, I still was with Nathaniel and Chris, my unsuspecting husband, or so I thought. One night, Chris and I were watching a movie and it was really awkward. The movie was about a woman who was cheating on her husband, and when her husband found out about it, he killed her. It was very scary, not exactly the film, but my heart because I knew I was in a similar situation. I didn't know why Chris had decided to pick such a movie. In fact, he had insisted on being the one to choose the movie we wanted to watch, which I didn't see as a big deal at first, not until he had played the movie, and it was like watching my own life being acted on TV. Chris had playfully said I should never cheat on him or even bring home my affair. My heart had been beating so fast that day, and I wondered if Patricia had finally told him, but I played along and laughed nervously, telling him I could never cheat on him. I remember now how he had looked at me strangely and then stood up abruptly and said he was going to bed. But back then, I was just so bothered with trying to hide the panic in my voice that I guess I wasn't looking at the signs that he knew. I ignored his warnings about not bringing my affair to our house. I wish I didn't, because eventually that turned out to be my greatest mistake ever. I continued seeing Nathaniel and was even becoming bolder, because Nathaniel started spending the night at my place. The first time had been a mistake. We had both been too drunk and high and just slept off. Luckily, Chris had to work overnight again, but the morning after I woke up to see Nathaniel in our bed, I panicked and quickly sent him out. But it became regular, and Nathaniel would prefer to come over to my house instead of using his luxurious house. He had told me one time that for some reason, having sex in that house with me was great because he felt like he was helping me defile my strict father in some weird way, and that alone satisfied him. I probably should have stopped, but my greediness just had no limits, and I couldn't imagine not having Nathaniel's money to spend on my clothes, jewelry, and sort out my bills. I was so greedy to the extent that whenever Chris still gave me from the little he had, I still collected it. I thought I had the best double life. I was managing 2 men, and they both didn't know about the other. At the time, it had felt satisfying because I had the best of 2 worlds. A husband that loved me and a lover that satisfied my every need. It was a win-win situation. I was happy, but then again, that didn't last. I wish I had just read the signs, which were as obvious as a signboard on the street. I wish I had just known when to just stop, but clearly I thought I had it all. That day, Chris had told me he was traveling for a seminar and wouldn't be back for another 3 days. I played the sad wife and even drove him to the airport, kissed him goodbye, and watched him go. Then I went back home, showered, and gave Nathaniel a call. Told him that my daddy was halfway across the world and that we were free for the day. Nathaniel, of course, rushed over, and, as usual, we did lots of crazy things together. And, of course, he slept over on my matrimonial bed. I was having my bath the next morning, and when I heard the door open, I thought it was Nathaniel, so I didn't bother. I heard hushed voices, but the water splashing on the bathroom floor didn't help me hear whatever or whoever it was speaking. Thinking it was probably Nathaniel making a business call, I stepped out of the bathroom naked, with the intention of seducing Nathaniel while he was on the phone, as he tends to get distracted easily by my body, especially when speaking to someone else. With that thought in mind, I made my way to the living room, calling out Nathaniel's name, only to stop dead. My heart probably stopped beating for 2 seconds before picking up pace and beating fast and loudly. Nathaniel and Chris were there. In the same room, Patricia was also there, and when they all turned and saw me, I screamed and ran into the room to take a robe and lock myself in. I was doomed. I was finally ruined, and I didn't even have any control of the situation. I knew I had to eventually come out and face them, but I couldn't forget that Chris had extra keys to every door in the house. I heard the click in the door before I could even react, and all 3 of them were inside the room that I was in. Suddenly, the room seemed to shrink, and I couldn't breathe properly. Nathaniel looked at me with anger. Patricia looked at me with pity, but Chris was the most painful of all. I cannot forget the sadness mixed with pain and anger in his eyes. I didn't know what to say. I was just gasping and opening and closing my mouth without a word coming out, like a fish trying to gasp for breath on dry land. They both knew, and now I was completely ruined. Nathaniel just left, but not before apologizing to Chris that he didn't know I was married because I had lied to him, saying I lived with my strict dad. Chris let him go, didn't speak or do anything but nod his head. After Nathaniel left, Patricia excused herself and left too. At that moment, I wished I could drag her back by her hair and beat her up. She ruined my life, and she looked at me like I was a piece of garbage waiting to be thrown into the trash bin. But I had bigger things to worry about. Chris was right in front of me, looking at me so differently from how he used to look at me all those years, and I couldn't bear it. I got on my knees and began to plead. Days before that, I was so sure I couldn't abandon my lifestyle or exchange it for anything else. But that day, seeing the way Chris was looking at me, I could have exchanged anything at all, to get rid of that look in his eyes. Apparently, Chris knew I was cheating on him long before Patricia even found out, and he also found out about my fake pregnancy and the real one that I got rid of. The warning he gave me that day was real. Apparently, he had purposely made us watch that film because he had hoped I'd learn and come forward to him or even change. But I had obviously continued. Chris wanted nothing to do with me again and wanted a divorce. He sent me out of our house and never wants to see me again. Nathaniel, on the other hand, sued me and collected every dime I had ever taken from him, which left me penniless and in serious debt. I sold all my jewelry, bags, and clothes to get some money to pay him, even though that wasn't enough, and I was still in debt because Nathaniel was bent on destroying my life for using him. Chris sent me divorce papers, but I cannot bring myself to sign them. I cannot afford to lose Chris. I love him so much, and I feel like a horrible person for doing this to him. Please, I really need advice on what to do to keep my home. I cannot lose him, please. Update. Hello, Reddits. I know I probably deserve all the words and insults I've received, but I had written with the hope that someone out there would understand why I did what I did. But then again, even I cannot believe I let my greed consume me. I thought I was entitled to a more luxurious life, and I justified my actions by telling myself that my husband wasn't providing enough. But I was just a greedy and stupid woman. I thought I was trying to avoid living like my mother did, but I just ended up doing the same things she's done, only mine has more consequences. I remember the thrill of attention from someone else, the rush of feeling wanted and desired. But it was all a lie. I traded my integrity, my marriage, and my self-respect for temporary pleasures, and mostly for material possessions. Now all I'm left with is the guilt and shame of my own infidelity. I wish I had realized earlier in life to appreciate what I had and not lived my life desperate for things that would have probably come eventually. I have to go out to get a job, but it's easier said than done because when you have no experience and are hoping to get a job with a certificate that probably has more dust than an attic, it's tough. I really wish I had done everything differently and not done what I did, especially to Chris. He was a good man and undeserving of what I've done to him. I wish I had another chance to show him I've changed and that I'm not that person anymore. But life doesn't give second chances, and all I can do now is live with the consequences of my actions. My greed and selfishness destroyed everything that truly mattered to me. My self-centeredness caused me to lose everything that could have made me truly happy, but I was blind to them because I felt I knew what truly mattered, and that was a big lie. I have nothing left, nothing at all apart from debts. I don't even have the will to live because I wake up each morning and then I'm confronted again by my own actions that have left me stuck in my own nemesis. I'm sure Chris cannot even forgive me. I mean, how could he even when I cannot forgive my stupidity? All I live by each day is the fact that I have to pay for my own sins. Every day is agony, not physically but emotionally. I have a million what-ifs running through my head. The funny thing is, if I hadn't been caught, I may not have realized what I was doing was wrong. And then I was caught, and I wish I could turn back the hands of time and redo everything right, from never crossing paths with Mona to not meeting Nathaniel, who I'm sure has already moved on to the next exciting thing in his life. I feel so empty most times, and yet so full of the things I've done and now regret. I remember all the people I've hurt just to get what I wanted, and I wish I could retrace my footsteps and apologize to them. It's almost painful having to live with myself. I wish I could detach my mind from my body so I'd just have, even if it's an hour without all the thoughts crushing me. I know how depressed I am, and I can't even blame anyone but myself. I live every day of my life thinking of things I really would have done differently and how I ended up the way I did. But there's no one to blame for my actions, not even my own parents. It's so hard getting by each day. Every day just keeps getting harder than the other. I really wish. I wonder how Chris is faring, though. Since the divorce, he left the city and traveled, maybe permanently, probably to get rid of anything that reminded him of me. A few weeks after, I confirmed his relocation was permanent, as I saw a house agent with a client viewing the house. I cried hard that day. A house that was once my beautiful and happy home, but greedy me just wanted things I didn't have, and those things eventually aren't even with me anymore. Crazy how life is, right? What a man loves could kill him, they say. Mine has not only killed me, but ruined me totally. I lost the one thing that was supposed to be the most important in my life. Anytime I had a stomach bug, I would remember exactly what I did with the child that once was growing there, and that alone would throw me another foot down into depression. I'm a terrible person, I know, and I admit it. I cannot heal from this. I will forever pay for my sins. Even forever, I know, might not be enough to pay totally for the evil things I did to Chris and my baby. Update. Hello, Reddits. This is probably my last post here. I just wanted to say how thankful I am to be able to express myself here, regardless of the backlash I received. I know I've done stupid things and will never recover from them. I cannot even forget all the hurtful things I did to Chris, but it was nice being able to talk about my feelings, despite that it didn't reduce the guilt or help lift the weight off my chest. It's been almost 12 months already since I lost what really mattered in my life, and I'm still the same, penniless, guilty, depressed, and shameful. I know I could never heal from all the hurts I caused Chris. He was everything I ever wanted, and yet I ruined everything by my careless actions. I will forever regret the things I did and how I've ended at the end. I have no hope for the future because the future I once had and should have cherished, I lost. Now all I'm stuck with is this endless dream that I wake up to every day. This dream with no Chris in it. At least at night when I sleep, I still dream of how happy we used to be. One time, I even dreamt of being pregnant and having a baby. But then I woke up to the reality of no Chris to make me happy, and what I did to ruin what we had. One word of advice before I end this would be that I hope that others can learn from my mistakes and cherish what they have before it's too late. Goodbye, everyone.